Hello, everyone. Very welcome to second day of BTR. Thank you for tuning in. We feel privileged to have Professor Currie from University of Monash University. So Professor Currie is the director of Monash Institute of Transport Studies in Australia, Melbourne. And Graham also leads a public transport research group. Graham, also you are one of the on the board organizers of ATRF conferences, right?
Yes, I'm the president of ATRF.
Oh, president of ATRF, yes, and which is the Australian Transport Research Forum, which this year will be in Perth on 29th of November up to 1st of December, Perth, Western Australia. And yeah, so we feel very privileged to have Professor Currie, who will talk about pragmatic strategies to legitimize implementation of sustainable transport in cities. So just a bit of housekeeping. Everyone is muted, but I would appreciate if you type your questions in Q&A or in the chat box. You can just post it on chat box. So I will monitor the questions and then I will read it to Professor Currie after his talk. But also, if you feel comfortable asking your question, just text me. Type me the direct message in the chat box, and then I can unmute you, and then you can go ahead. I think everyone also should be able to unmute themselves. That's at least my understanding. So with that, then I hand it over to you, Graham. Thank you so much. I'll mute myself. Over to you.
Thanks, Elsa. Yes, so this is a presentation about pragmatic strategies to legitimize implementation of sustainable transport in cities. It's about how to get sustainable transport done in the real world of political, institutional, public opposition. I badged this with my PhD, with my research fellow now, James Reynolds, who was doing his PhD on this topic. This is the PhD. It's his PhD work, but it was a team effort involving industry, because it's about how you go about what you do as a transport planner that will be more successful. It's about successful strategies to actually implement stuff. In particular, we had Vic Roads involved in this, and they were an industry partner, and they were able to use their experience of having success and failure in projects to help us. I'm going to talk about the context, what legitimacy is, and then about pragmatic strategies that we've developed. I'll just have a short review and close. So, we've done a heck of a lot of research on many aspects of public transport, but in particular on running buses and trams on streets, on-road priority for public transport. Just to give you a flavour, we've done meta-studies of benefits and published this widely about the types of effects from bus lanes, grid-centred busways, and so forth. We changed the model, which was conventionally used in TCRP 80. It's the one on the left, which said that, there were step changes in projects related to their travel time benefits, where there was passenger time savings, operating cost savings in services, mode shift, and even development. And we realized that these were not true. They were actually cumulative. So the model on the left is from some of our research. We were able to make a big discovery, was that bus lanes and bus priority has a significant improvement on road safety. 66% drop in off-path accidents with bus lanes, 50% drop in side collisions as a result of bus lanes. And, nobody on planet Earth was actually planning bus lanes to improve road safety, yet they do. And it should be considered when we change the road space. We were the first researchers to actually include the mode shift benefits of public transport priority in the evaluation of their projects. We also did some theoretical work. We realized that there were three types of cities that we deal with in our planning. Cities where the car dominates and public transport's only there for social reasons on the x-axis here. cities at the far end that are completely trying to replace the car in cities with public transport, or cities in the middle, which is Australian cities, where transit's really only for the peak period where there's too much congestion. And the type of priority you would provide on the y-axis, the state of the art, really depends on where you are in that axis. And where you're trying to completely replace the car, you shouldn't be running on streets. You should be running in right-of-way A, which is grade separated, or right-of-way B, where you longitudinally separate the right-of-way of the transit system apart from at intersections. Or even if you're in right-of-way C, which is mixed traffic, you should be having full-time bus lanes and signal priority with preemption, the getting through systems. So we've done a lot of research in this area, and we can claim a lot of benefits from the work we've done. Now, why am I talking to you about all this? Well, the reason I'm telling you all of this is because, in my opinion, science, technology, engineering, and research do not matter. Okay? It's not making any difference to the real world. Why? Because, yeah, we can write papers about it, but in the end, our problem with priority is that we cannot get it implemented. The technical answers are known, but implementation in the real world is hard. Our clients in industry who are trying to do this cannot implement these things because of local opposition. It's a fundamental problem in the industry. So we decided to do a research project on working out how we can solve this fundamental barrier for global progress in this area. We were dealing with something called legitimacy. How can we implement policies that are legitimate? Well, we all know the graphics, such as this one, that road space is limited in cities, and buses and bikes are extremely efficient ways of carrying people other than cars. So we already know there's a legitimacy, if you like, to do with space, but there's lots of types of legitimacy. It's actually difficult in the real world to implement stuff. You might well want to implement bus lanes and bike lanes, but in practice, there's pressure from road users in actually using this, and often they're withdrawn for this reason. In Melbourne, we were trying to implement more advanced stops, which were sustainable for disabled people, and councillors were saying we won't have them because it's going to affect cycling. So, there is conflict out there, and to implement things, we need to chart a path through all of these barriers, and that's what we were doing. We're doing some research to try and establish how we could chart the way through these barriers in the real world. There are many types of legitimacy. In this particular photograph, the protesters are all disabled, and they're arguing that they have a legal right, a normative legitimacy, because of the Disability Discrimination Act, the federal act in Australia that says by law they have to have access to the tram. So they're saying it's a normative legitimacy. But there's also legitimacy through reasonableness. It's just not reasonable that disabled people are not allowed to use the tram. Is there a legitimacy through trust? Maybe engineers recommend this and we trust the engineers to do that. Is there a sociological legitimacy where there's widespread support for the DD? And I'm sure there is. Is there legitimacy through consent? We could actually ask voters to vote on it. Is there an unconditional duty type of legitimacy where cyclists must always have a bike lane? We don't have that rule, but we could. Or is there conditional normative support, which is often called NIMBYism? I agree with these DBA compliance for disability access, but not without a bike lane or not without on-street parking. There's lots of views on this. How do we navigate this was the focus of the research. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to the outcome of the research first, because I'm going to navigate our way through this. We created something called the Legitimacy Framework. It's a very simple XY graphic. It says the x-axis is the amount of legitimacy that is out there in the real world, and the y-axis is the amount of, in this case, priority or sustainable transport that's provided. And the way it works is we can map over time how this progresses. the starting point is point one, where we start when we've got the existing situation. The amount that's provided at the moment is legitimate. We propose to improve legitimacy. We promote the idea of doing something different. Then we implement it. Go to point three. If there's lots of opposition, we would say, okay, we'll take it away. Complaints and protests. Or if it might fail and be removed. Or we could, create success by having implemented something. There's a way of charting through this path using this thing we call the legitimacy framework. And I'll take you an example of one. This is a part of Melbourne CBD where we've got a tram. The tram stop you see there is not accessible for disabled people. It's a centre road stop, and no one can get access to it, and there's no platform for disabled people on a wheelchair. So the Disability Discrimination Act gave us normative legitimacy. It is now by law, we have to do it. And this was the plan. Some consultation was done with a survey where we actually asked the people to try and get more buy-in on the project. And then from that, we actually provided the stops, and they were bought, and everybody was happy with that. There they are there. But if we go further north, we look in the same street, 3 tram stops were proposed there. Again, this is them. There's a curbside stop here where you've got to walk across to the tram in the middle of the road. It was proposed through the Disability Discrimination Act. We make this accessible for disabled people. But the Greens councillors opposed it. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. They legally went against this. There was protests from the disabled lobby. And then a new proposal came about, which was this type of stop. We call it a driver over stop, easy access stop. It's called. It's actually a ramp and a platform, and also cyclists can use it. So that's how that was path. That was using the Legitimacy framework to find a path through the way to get implementation. So the research came up with the idea that we'll go and have a look at the best projects in the world and ask, what was their legitimacy path? Maybe we can learn something from these projects of how they were developed, and that will help us understand how to go about project implementation in future. What's the legitimacy framework for successful projects? We started by looking at Curitiba in Brazil, which has got this fantastic busway. It's said to be the cradle of all mass bus rapid transit system development in the world. It's been one of the great developments in transit in the last 20, 30 years. We thought we'd ask the question, well, how did this get implemented? What was its path through objections and so forth? Well, it was a very interesting place to start, because we found some very interesting stories which changed the legitimacy framework. For a start, it didn't start with the busway. It started with pedestrianisation of a mall in the city centre. This was the project that preceded it, and it was successful, and it caused the busway to happen. This is the mall today, and it started because there was a governor and a military dictatorship. A very relevant context. It started by the mayor of the town saying he's going to implement pedestrianisation. He did not seek legitimacy. He actually implemented it on a Friday without any consultations, when the law courts were closed. So there's no legal injunctions. The roads were closed. A new mall was completed by Monday over the weekend. There were armed police, but there was no use of force and no direct objections during the weekend. Next week, the retailers got together and they asked the governor to sack the mayor for doing it. The governor said, no, we're going to give it 30 days and I'll consider your work. The mayor then said, okay, we will have a 30-day trial. So if you look at the legitimacy framework, what happened is it was implemented before it was legitimate. They actually proactively went on the other side of the graph, which we didn't think you could do. They actually implemented it first. And then, over time, the mall proved successful. The retailers suddenly realized they were making money. It was a great success, and then it was expanded and expanded because there was strong buy-in to the idea. It's an example of you provide it and they will agree and they'll see the benefits. So after that was a success, the mayor was very popular. He went on to suggest the busway, and the busway was developed. People got to see it was good, and they continued doing this. Now, could this happen anywhere other than a multi-dictatorship? Can it happen in a democracy? Key questions. But nevertheless, the way it went about success was by first going on the other end of the graphic. They actually went up first, implemented first, before it was implemented, before it was considered valid or legitimate. So the research then went on to ask this question in lots of other cities. And we tried to navigate how those cities had changed. We looked at some successes and failures in Melbourne. We looked at Zurich, which is known to have a very successful tram system with great priority. We looked at King Street and also in Boston. And we were trying to work out how we navigate this path through the system for each of those cities. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the case studies. I'm going to tell you what happened at the end of the research, because at the end of the research, we found that there were really 9 approaches that authorities can adopt to try and implement pragmatic strategies for implementation. I'm going to go through those strategies and show you some examples from the case studies. We found something very interesting out when we did the case studies. We found that, in fact, the legitimacy framework has some red bits in it, which are hard. Bits of this legitimacy and also the amount of transit priority provided. There are elements where there is negative impacts on road users, and the strategies you use have to be different for those areas. And in the end, we established that there were 3 key approaches. Approach A, you build legitimacy first, going on the x-axis first. Approach B, you avoid the impacts on all other road users in the red bit by avoiding them. Or you use approach C, where you build legitimacy by actually implementing. You go north first, you go vertical. Let's have a look at how that looks like. This is approach A. You try and persuade people to that it's a good idea first, and then you can build your project. Approach B says, well, you can build your project, just avoid the red bits. And that's through things like grade separation. I'll talk about these individually next. Or you do what they did in Currie. You take the bold approach of actually going up and doing it first. You have to be very brave to do that, but it can work. All right, let's take you through these with some examples. Let's start with the pragmatic strategies. Here they are. There's 9 of them, A, B, C. A1 is part of A, building legitimacy before implementation. The first thing you could do is actually have a technical inquiry. There's loads of examples of this. Environmental impact assessments. A great case study we looked at was the St. Clair corridor in Toronto. Lots of disagreement about what should be happening there. Yeah, the engineers have got a nice plan, but can you get it implemented? So they had a technical inquiry with people involved showing evidence, a process to show the public the data, use of engineering principles, and what the benefits were. In Melbourne, our own authority, VicRoads, has got something called the Smart Roads Guidelines, and they even have a little app which will demonstrate in easy to understand ways what the benefits and costs of a project are, using GIS and mapping tools to actually summarize what these are. So you can use technical data to persuade people and show them what the data is. What about the second approach, A2? This is transport planning, very common approach. And this involves developing strategic plans for cities. My own cities had Linking Melbourne, Victorian Transport Plan, Melbourne 2030. And each of these have developed strategies to try and tackle problems. They're public documents, and projects fall out of them. In Toronto, we've had the big bill, big moves, and the even bigger moves. And these strategies have all had projects coming from them which aim to achieve these things, to build buy-in, legitimacy before you implement. You can also have a good example, actually, is Currie again. They had public plans once they developed the first bits of the busway network, and these were visioning plans to look at how you might go about them in a longer term, and this helped them develop into the future. Now, what about the next one, which is avoiding impacts on other road users? Oh, sorry, public processes. Sorry, this is A3, public process or hearings. Well, the greatest example of this is the Zurich. Now, in Zurich, in Switzerland, they have a lot of public involvement in politics, and they had a plebiscite, they had a vote, and the public, the Citizens Transit Priority Initiative, went to the public for them to vote in this sort of initiative. And the proposal was that the trams should be given priority on tracks to virtually go as fast as possible that is technically possible on those roads, regardless of the impacts of other users. The public vote was agreed on a 51% majority. So it wasn't hugely in favor, but it was more than 50%. And of course, we have funding proposals like this in the United States during your elections, you know, the various technical measures that go part of the elections. So it's an example of this sort of thing where legitimacy happens during a vote and the majority of the people will vote for it. Therefore, it becomes illegitimate to implement it. What about Group B, avoiding impacts on other road users? Well, the obvious example is grid separation. What this is, here's Toronto. Here's a tram line running along the wharf, the quay. It runs on street on the left, and then it goes into a portal, and it's operating underground. When you get into the city centre, where all the traffic is, and you avoid the impact. Now, as long as you've got the money to build this, who's going to complain? But getting the money to build it is actually the big problem here, because it then becomes a funding decision. But it does avoid the problem of implementation. If you can put this infrastructure in, and if you've got the money, that's how you avoid the political problem in environments where the car dominates. There are other ways of doing this. You can build new capacity on roads that allow you to provide the system, but it doesn't harm the car. There's been plenty of examples of this in Melbourne. The example on the left is a typical 3-lane road with no bus lane at the top. And then you can take one of those lanes to run the bus. But that squeezes the traffic into 2 lanes. Or the option 3 on the bottom there is you can build a new lane, a new road to run the road on. And who's going to complain about that? Because no traffic is harmed. Another example in Melbourne is on the right. This is running buses on our Eastern Freeway down the emergency stopping lane. It's effectively a busway for free, and it doesn't really harm cars. They're not allowed to use it, but they don't use it anyway. It does have some operational problem when there's a breakdown, but there's not very often breakdowns. So you see, it's a way of getting priority, which you don't really harm users. There's another way of doing this, something we call subservience. This is basically just providing priority with nobody being harmed. And in Curitiba, they have these boarding tubes. This is where you pay the fare as you enter into the tubes. You don't delay the bus when you're entering the vehicle. Also, you get level entry into the vehicle because it's a platform, so everybody boards quicker and alights quicker. So it's just an example of subservience. You're not actually harming anybody by this quicking up the system. Also in Melbourne, we have hook turns. These are a special traffic movement. It just gets out of the way of trams. Doesn't really harm traffic. It can be actually a good thing for traffic. It can be safer. And also turn bands don't really too much harm traffic, but in the end, it's quite effective for transit. Now, what about the last group? These are the sort of interesting group. You've got to be brave for these, where you're trying to build a legitimacy through actually doing things. Very interesting way to do this. But in fact, it's very doable depending on your perspective. The most effective way is taking a long-term view, something we call bottom-up. Now, this is a place called Fitzroy Street. It's a bit of an old graphic. And you see there a stop with barriers, which is in the middle of the road. It's not accessible. There's no protection from traffic around the stop, so you can get U-turns, you can get vehicles going in there. And then a few years later, the traffic engineers put some paint in. There was no plan to put the paint in. There was no public inquiry about the impacts of putting the paint in. Nobody complained because nobody noticed the paint was put in, but it did improve the performance at the intersection. And then a couple of years later, a plan came up to beautify the street, and they put a tree in with a bit of curbing. And what that does is it segregates the right of way of the tram to make it a proper light railway. There was no plan to do that. There was no public consultation of the plan. There was no public vote of the plan. Nobody noticed that it had been put in. But over a period of years between the graphic on the left and the graphic on the right, what has effectively happened is the tramway has gone from a streetcar, on-street running mixed with traffic, to a light railway, its own right of way. It's a superb improvement in the quality of priority, but it was done over such a long time and slowly, nobody objected to it, and it was very doable. There's lots of examples of this in Melbourne. A great example, this is one of the busiest tram stops in Melbourne. It was built for disability access reasons because of the national legislation. Disabled people have to access this stop. I hope you can see it's got great features in it for level access to the tram. It's even got great pedestrian access, which really spins down the road. But when they built this stop for disability access reasons, they also put this into the road at the side, some curbing. They put a little bit of curbing to stop the cars going on a tram track. Now, that's got nothing to do with disability legislation. There's no plan to put the curbing in. There's no objections to putting the curbing in. It just happened. Indeed, on the other end of the tram stop, you'll see here, looking at the other end, you'll see there's this great big lump of concrete on the road. It's a pedestrian verge, so the pedestrians are out of traffic and protected when they're crossing the road. That's got nothing to do with disability legislation, which justified the stop. But it was put in by the authority when they were building this, the traffic engineers, as a bottom-up treatment. It effectively stopped all U-turns on the road. It was a bottom-up treatment. And you might think, oh, well, takes a long time and we're very hard to do. Well, in a period of about 15 years, I would suggest, all of the central area of Melbourne has now become a segregated right of way for trams because of small treatments like this. There was no plan to do this. There was no public consultation to do this. There was no objections to doing this. Nobody really noticed it. It's very, very doable. Bottom-up strategies. Now, another one, quite recent, is something called Popups. There's been lots of this now. In fact, at TRB a few years ago, there was a great set of presentations on what are called tactical transit lanes. And the photograph you see there is a picture of Boston, street in Boston, where the mayor of the area decided over a weekend that they'd implement a bus lane without any public consultation. They'd just put some witches' hats out and they just run this thing as a bus lane and see what happened. They were quite clever about it. They did a passenger survey to see what the benefits were. They monitored very carefully how the buses improved their reliability. And in the end, were able in the media to show and demonstrate the benefits of this. And you don't necessarily need to be the mayor or the authority. There's been a great example in America of the guerrilla safety people in this example. These activists bought some traffic cones, some cycling pylons, and put them on the road and then painted in a cycling lane themselves overnight. What happened was the people of Seattle, the authorities, didn't split the dummy. They said, well, you're not supposed to do that. And they took them down and they gave all the material back to them. And they said, don't do it again. But what happened shortly afterwards was the authority actually made it permanent. Now, the problem I think we've got in our world is that we don't just try doing stuff enough. we go with the flow of the status quo, because that's a nice, easy life. We do need to try and do things and sample things to make the world better. So those are the last group of strategies is what we call trials. Now, we did a couple of these case studies. Some examples of trials include in Toronto, the King Street trial, a very busy streetcar corridor. It was known that it was a big problem of interaction of lots of trams with traffic. And there was a visioning study suggested that they should do something. And from all of that, they agreed to have a trial, proposed King Street Transit trial on that street. This is the trial here. They went about the trial. They already said it was going to be a trial. They're just going to have a try of doing things differently. And what happened first was that a lot of people didn't like it. This is Canadians doing what Canadians do. They protest really well by having an ice hockey game on the tram route to protest against the trial. Some of the restaurants protested in their own little way by having ice sculptures to the trams. And then there was a lot of media coverage saying that there was problems, but the mayor said, hey, you know, nobody said it was going to be good on the first day. Give it a chance. And then the mayor had a strategy to try and animate the street. The traders were worried about this strategy. He was upfront by it. They told the truth to the public. They said, they're just trying this out. Let's monitor how it goes. And if it doesn't work, we won't do it. They were very open with the idea of the trial. A big part of what they did then was they decided to create this bulletin, a dashboard that went out every month to look at what had happened to the trial. It's a very easy to read document about point of sale data, cycling volumes, the reliability improvement, how pedestrian flows have changed. And what do you know? After a little while, people started realizing it was working. King Street trial was working, was in the media. And suddenly the story was, hey, this might be taken away from us. Isn't it bad? It's really going to be uncertain in the future. Maybe we should have it for all the time. And then the council voted for it. So it's an example of a good trial working out. But we had a great example in Melbourne of where it didn't work. This was in Clarendon Street in Melbourne, very similar operation. People were very concerned when they had the trial that it wasn't really a trial. They thought that this was just they were calling it a trial, and it was actually just policy. They were going to make the change. There was a lot of distrust in the people that were doing it. But the authority did something similar. They started producing data only on the tram operations, but this is their data to the public of how the tram operations have changed. But I hope you can see that it's unreadable. Okay. Now I do a lot of this stuff scientifically. I still can't quite work out what it says. And Joe public wouldn't have a hope. And it really contrasts with the approach that they took in King Street in Toronto. So if you're going to do this sort of thing, you've got to kind of be a little bit open and honest about it so people believe in it. And also have really quality information that can talk not just about the community impacts on trams, but also the community impacts on businesses, pedestrian flow, and all the other users. So that's it from me. These are the 9 strategies. Avoiding strategy group A is about building legitimacy first. Strategy group B is about avoiding impacts on other users. And C is about building legitimacy through implementation first, the type of thing we don't do enough of. And this is shown to have created these great project outcomes. And we need to start thinking about how to go about implementing these things to get these outcomes. So if you're interested in this topic, please, you can use the link there to download James Reynolds' doctoral thesis. It goes through in depth the history of what happened here. He's a meticulous researcher on the outcomes because we didn't really know what we're looking for. We had to understand the entire history, but a traffic engineer trawling through historical evidence using public policy theory, very, very challenging for a PhD. But I think the outcome was quite remarkable in finding a way forward for what's critical for our cities for new future developments. We have published this. It's hard to publish this material because a lot of it's case study work. We did some publications, which you can see there. And also we wrote a chapter in the Handbook of Public Transport Research, which is out there. We put together with a lot of key researchers. And we have a chapter 10, which is really a summary of the research and its outcomes, what it might mean for the future of cities. And this can be used for any measures, not just public transport priority measures. Any sustainability measures can be adopted that focus on road space and publicly concerned initiatives where traders and politicians get involved. In addition, if you're interested, we run the Researching Transit podcast series, where we interview the top researchers in the world in the field. Episode 2 was on James's PhD thesis. There he is there. And also one of our case studies was in Zurich, and Andrew Nash, involved in TRB a lot. He talked about the work in Zurich that we were able to identify those strategies from. And also you can look at our website, ptrg.info, if you're interested. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Currie. So I can see many comments from Cara. Cara, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, or if you like, I can read those.
Oh, thank you. You know, I'm here on Wi-Fi, so I think you're probably the better one to read those.
Awesome. Okay, so well, Professor Currie, that was very great and insightful presentation. The fact that we should not really design our cities based on what we see, we should design them based on what we want to see, and that kind of shift from the predict and provide paradigm to decide and provide paradigm. So that's the shift that I think all transport engineers kind of should move to that kind of thinking. So the first comment that I can see from Cara is basically the status quo bias. Let me just start from the first one. So the status quo bias is a serious issue in most anything big, unless the alternative is clearly more convenient and clear. Then it looks like, yeah, that's one of the comments about the status quo bias, that when people, maybe they're not, that's my interpretation from the comment, that people may not really fully aware of what would be the benefit of some future projects for them. So for instance, as soon as you start talking about blocking or taking a lane and then allocating it to, for instance, a bicycle lane, then all of the business owners, they would say, oh, well, what I'm going to do with the pickup and delivery, I will lose my customers, etc. So that kind of a status bias, then if they know that perhaps it would lead to more, for instance, walking, more activity, like active transport activities around their businesses, it could be even more profitable for them than just cars crossing with higher speed. So that, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we are researchers. I think most people in this presentation would be, trying to find things out. And yes, good information can help persuade people. But frankly, the status quo dominates. Where we are now, that there is real intractability about the situation now. The authorities are very, very shy about change. They would like to make change, but they politically find it very difficult. And of course, all the benefits for making change are not there. It's risky. They can lose their jobs if a politician really is not happy about a situation. And this really causes lack of change. I don't think you can persuade a lot of these objectors using evidence. I think you need to find other ways of doing it. You can demonstrate through this. You can trial. You can have pop-ups. We just don't do enough of this. And the great thing about a trial or a pop-up, implementing first and then getting legitimacy later, is if it doesn't work, you can take it away. The political risks are quite small We don't do enough of this. And really, I would like to see our focus in teaching in transport planning and transport research transitioning from techno-rationalist use of mathematical models and computers to actually teaching people, planners, strategies to implement approaches to actually get outcomes we know are right to be implemented in practice using approaches like this. We just literally do not have a discipline that tells people how to go about the tactics of doing this. You know, the journal Transport Policy doesn't really talk about transport policy. It talks about mathematical models to explain things. And there needs to be a new profession, a new focus on knowledge about how we achieve things in the real world. Because frankly, progress is not big enough yet for climate change and so forth.
Yeah, true. So thinking out of the box, and perhaps with the use of, like, for instance, virtual reality, then you can kind of just simulate that what's going on, and then you can just have those community workshops with people or business owners. Then they can see that what will be the future, perhaps, you know, that kind of thing could help. Again, or maybe.
What's the question? Sorry.
Oh, no. The question, I was just thinking about, like, those educational campaigns. I was thinking even with the use of virtual reality simulations, then we can kind of also provide the future possibilities. So the thing that, like, designers have in mind is sometimes I think also it's difficult to kind of pitch it to people, like ordinary people, that would. So if we have a bike lane in this street, then that would be the prospect of that. And
again, it's using scientific evidence, in my opinion, to try and prove the case. I don't believe in the real world they want to listen to proof. People need to see it. I'm afraid that researchers and a lot of policy professionals are engineering focused and techno-rationalist. They believe numbers and data can prove to us that we can get the right answers. And certainly they can do that, but they can't implement it. That's the problem. We know there are solutions out there today we can't do. So we need to have a profession that can actually find a way to implement that. I hear what you say about virtual reality. It's very clever, but if people won't listen anyway, I'm not too sure that a new approach is going to help. What we need to do is find a way for the profession to make changes by actually being able to implement things successfully in the real world.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next comment that Cara had was for implementing very short-term policies. For instance, in Copenhagen, that they implemented the road tolls just during peak periods for a month, and then they had the population vote for the congestion tolls and then had it. I think also another case study I remember in San Francisco bike bus lane, that they took one of the lanes from John F. Kennedy thing, and then they had it only for Fridays. They trialed it on Fridays, and then once that they had this vote, then they made it permanent. So these apparently could also work, as you also mentioned.
Yeah, we've been presenting this for a while now. When we do it, it suddenly sparks in people who've got lots of experience in lots of other environments, examples of each of one of these things that fits within this framework. And that's great. We know we should have a website or something where people start realizing examples that fit into this framework. And this is where the profession should be. We should be showing and demonstrating examples of these things so the professional can learn from them. And we should be encouraging more experimentation using this in the real world to actually achieve change.
Yes. Okay, so also I can see some other comments that Cara think that the pedestrian, pedestrian interval, like signalized crossing, speed cameras, etc. People generally don't object to these kind of things because perhaps they perceive that as like some safety measures, so they can accept it more openly. Whereas, for instance, for that, like hockey protest, that was interesting one. I wasn't aware of it. And so Cara mentioned that it reminded her of the Waymo and Cruise's shared autonomous EVs that people at the night they threw the traffic cones into streets at night. Interesting. So after a while, perhaps, yeah, they stopped it. I can. Yeah. So I think there were not like questions, just comments, and
Yep.
there was another one. So let me go to Gian. So Gian, would you like to ask your question? Unmute yourself and ask.
Sure. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. The Currie case is certainly a bit of an outlier. So I was curious, in the case of more capital intensive strategies where bottom-up strategies or like trials might be a little bit more difficult, and it's very easy for the public to say like, no, we don't want tracks or we don't want new rails. How should we go about in that case?
That's a great question. And I think the first thing to be cognizant of is you don't need to do this quickly. It actually is more successful if you do it in a sustained way, slowly, because the whole point here is that change is achieved slowly and nobody really notices, and you get benefits as a result. A great example is in Melbourne. Whenever there was some roadworks, the electricity company needed to dig up the road, so you had to resurface it. The traffic engineer just went over it and changed the road slightly. Nobody really noticed it had happened, but significant changes in the road was made. In particular, in Melbourne's case, we took the opportunity to raise the road where the tram operated. And as a result, it stopped being a streetcar mixed with traffic, and it became a separate right of way, if you like. Curbing for pedestrian verges was a great example of this. This happened to such a small space of time, but you could look virtually throughout Melbourne CBD by looking at street view images and so forth over time, and you see a transformation. It's a revolution virtually, but no one noticed it. Very powerful thing. You do need to have traffic engineers that understand that there are good things to achieve here. It's done at the street level, if you like. They call this actually in policy theory, street level bureaucrats, people who actually manage the street, who actually make changes without any strategy or high level policy inputs, but they're doing it for good, solid reasons, which creates sustainability outcomes.
So I can also see one comment from Lynette, and Lynette mentioned that the willingness to experiment or trial or pilot is partly cultural. Singapore has been trying to develop more participatory planning approaches, and we've seen easier pilots to pedestrianize some streets, but legitimizing large infrastructure decisions will be more difficult. Often policy decisions are made and it just happens.
Well, Land Transport Authority in Singapore has a research advisory board, and we've been part of that. So we're quite familiar with their approach to this. They have quite an inclusive approach to adopting strategies, which involves a great deal of consultation. I think that's a wise strategy because you don't want people to be too surprised about things. But one of the great things that LTA does more than almost most authority, I think, is try things out. Autonomous vehicles. I know you're having a session on autonomous vehicles. They really have been trying to find ways to get that to work there. They're very proactive about trying things. And, they objectively review these things. If they don't work, they don't use them. I think, to be honest, to be at the cutting edge of sustainability in the future in transport, authorities should be trialing more, taking risks, and learning from experiences of having tried things, not by just listening to the rest of the world and adopting whatever they use. They've got to build the buy-in in the public through demonstrating to them that these are good ideas.
Exactly. So what also I found out is that in more democratic countries, because people votes would matter, that's why politicians are more cautious and more conservative. Yes. So they don't take those really, aggressive policies that sometimes it's necessary actually to take those aggressive policies. Otherwise, you cannot really reach to your objectives like net zero target or these kind of things. So
I completely agree with you there. And now I've worked in many countries which don't have democratic principles of many flavors. And I think a lot of people in the high end of new technologies in transport, high-speed trains, autonomous cars, get very frustrated by the practicalities of the real world. And, we see, Middle Eastern developments of new autonomous vehicle systems, or the high-speed rail network in China, the dramatic transformation of the national rail network into the biggest in the world. Fantastic, you could implement that really quickly. Now, that's only one part of the story, though. The other part of the story is, you want to implement things quickly, you're often building things without talking to the local people, without their input, and without often harming them. We don't hear those stories. I mean, I will always take democracy any day, and I think most people, if they had a choice, probably would. But you're quite completely correct. There are different ways of approaches, and some are more dynamic, but they have their own problems. But democracy can't be held back by never being able to actually achieve things, because it's held back by trying to get the lowest common denominator of everybody agreeing with things. We need to be able to make steps forward, and transport planners need to be part of that, because it's our domain where we need to make the biggest differences in cities, because we're the second biggest part of climate change growth in the world. We're the only area of emissions growth that's growing, and the rest is we're getting better at it. We need to be able to find ways to solve those problems. It's in our bailiwick to do something about them.
Yeah. Right. So following up on that, there's a question from Fuad Huda, who asked, well, he thanks you for a great presentation first, and then he asked, what do you think should be the best approach for developing countries for implementing any new project where bureaucracy is a great challenge in contrast to local residents who are unaware of the benefit of such projects?
Yeah, well, this is the real question, isn't it? In the end, I am suggesting that bureaucracies get brave. They're not good at that. And that will be a real challenge, because bureaucracies do tend to like to be slow at movement. They're by definition not brave. In developing countries in particular, yeah, that's even more of a challenge. I do think bottom-up strategies are easier to implement in those contexts. You haven't got the infrastructure for grade separation, for example. Ironically, if you look at mass transit systems in a lot of the poorer Asian developing countries, they haven't got the money for them. They tend to always go for elevated structures. It's a kind of a nice generalization about the West. We tend to put our infrastructure below the ground to avoid the problems. Or in poor countries, they put them above the ground because that's all they can afford. It's unfortunate, but these are the trade-offs in the real world. I don't have any easy answers for bureaucracies, other than to suggest there are way forwards here that they should be trialing and learning from. I believe this is the beginning of a way forward for the future of cities, that we should start taking on these ideas and this framework and building a knowledge base about how to implement alternative strategies of this type pragmatically.
Yeah. Interesting. So one other relevant question is that in most developing countries that they have problem with people from countryside moving to the cities, if the city also is car-centric and most of the population does not know the benefit of public transport, sustainable modes, then what's the best way to enhance public transport? Is it to do a bottom-up approach, as you mentioned, dealing with a lot of bureaucracy, or top-down or top-up?
Yeah. The perspective is a great one. I see this in my career all the time. People from the country areas that don't understand it and they come to cities. Well, I think as long as they're shown good transit systems, they learn very quickly. They learn very quickly what's good. Of course, the starting point there is to have a good transit system, which is high frequency and so forth. And there is another truth. A lot of the changes I think we're going to see will take time, such as bottom-up approaches. And, who in the institutions, who in the public is going to take these things on? Well, it's going to be the people that are young now. and they have a very different perspective to these issues. They are literally our students today. Those are going to be the transport planners of tomorrow and the bureaucrats of tomorrow in these institutions. I think they have a strong passion for change and are quite turned off, if you like, by the lack of progress. And they would like to see ways forwards. And in many ways, this is a menu of things that you can do to try and get change. And my belief, I think, given that perspective of time, the people that are going to make this change are being born today. And we need to give them the tools to try and learn to do that and the environments in which they can be successful.
Yeah, well, I do have hopes in next generation, but sometimes also when you, because also I teach one course, Sustainable Transport Systems, that students are given a task to design a sustainable transport mode for a case study. Sometimes you just feel that they just go with very futuristic, but non-sustainable really
Yes.
thing that then I think
Well,
our education again comes back, I think, to your great points that we need to have curriculum.
I've just been looking at some of the chat questions there, and with a developing context, and I've very much had personal experience of this because I used to work with the World Bank in China. All of the technical advice given to developing countries from the West was about developing car solutions. It was exporting the predict and provide philosophy of the West to the developing countries. And a lot of the developing countries didn't know any better. I mean, one of my early tasks when I had hair was to go to China and tell them how to write timetables for their bus systems. They didn't have any timetables because their headways were every 2 minutes. There was a bus arriving every 2 minutes. They didn't need a timetable. And you know, we were exporting Western solutions to developing countries who already had very good solutions. They just needed the maintenance and knowledge and so forth. I do think we've exported the problems of the West into developing countries. And it's time developing countries stood up for themselves and started getting their own solutions, which are more workable. How do we do that? We tell the truth, and we recognize that we aren't going to solve the problem of Dakar or these massive mega cities through cars, even autonomous cars. They are not going to be able to operate in those environments. We need mass transit systems of huge scales for mega cities. And that truth is something we need to teach the developing world.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I think you have addressed all of the questions in the chat box, and we kind of like we're approaching to the next session, which would be actually connected and autonomous vehicles. Thank you so much, Professor Currie. We really enjoyed your presentation, and